Well, hello, everybody. John Leitzel here. I want to introduce to you Mary Smith, who's joining us today to share with us some of her own experience with the faithfulness of God, particularly as at Mercy Hill, we're digging into prayer throughout this summer. Mary is part of Main Street Church down in St. Charles, Missouri, one of the churches in our Lifelink family, where she and her husband are part of the leadership team there. And Mary has kindly agreed to share some of her story with us today. Mary, thank you so much for joining us. I don't have a big introduction for you, but recently Mary and I had been talking about prayer and how sometimes it can feel like things get worse first before getting better. And she's had a lot of experience of needing to reach the Lord in her life. So Mary, go ahead and just share with us, please.
Yeah, so I think most recently it came up when we were talking about really even in the context of worship, and that it's really about God coming to us and God being present with us. And I think sometimes we think that when we're praying or when we're worshiping or whatever, it's us going to God, and we don't really think about how God comes directly to us and God inhabits not only the praises, but the cries of his people. And I was really fortunate that I was born and raised in a Christian home in Southern California and was very involved in youth groups and things like that, and had, been a part of college ministry and those different kinds of things. So I feel like the foundation that I was given in my growing up years was just really solid. But I really think that when people ask me like, how do you know God is real? I think the first experience or the most defining experience that I've had in my life happened in the summer of 1992. My husband and I had moved to St. Louis, Missouri from Southern California so that my husband could go to Covenant Seminary. And we had been here just about a year. And ended up getting together with his family from California. They came here to St. Louis, and then we were going up to Milwaukee actually to visit his aunt and cousins. Some of them I had not met before. And so we were looking really forward to this family reunion and what we were going to be doing. And so a couple of days, I'm a nurse, and a couple of days before we were getting ready to leave, we had a 2-year-old. So I was taking care of the 2-year-old. Mark was in seminary, and I was running around kind of trying to get everything ready for our trip. And I sat down and I read a devotion actually by Johnny Erickson Tata, who was injured in a diving accident back in the 1960s and became a quadriplegic. And at the time I was working in spinal cord and head injury rehab, and had just really learned a lot from Johnny over the years, and had gotten to meet her a couple of different times. And so, it was one of those typical days. I was getting ready to go to the hospital to do a shift, and I was busy and keeping track of Johnny and all that stuff. And I sat down and I thought, okay, I've got to read my devotion really quick. And I literally read through it super quickly. But the verses that day were Lamentations 3:31 and 32. And it says, though God causes grief, he will bring compassion, so great is his unfailing love. And, I read she just kind of explained the verses and what the verses meant to her. And she was talking about the early years after she had become a quadriplegic, that she would lay there awake at night. And that was the scripture that God would bring to her mind, as though he allowed this grief and allowed the heartache to come in her life, he would bring compassion, and his love was unfailing. And then she went on to share some of the ways that he had done that. And I know continues to do that for her. And so I read it really quickly, and I was like, cool, okay, going about my day, and went to my shift at the hospital, and everybody was coming in, and we were busy, and I was packing. And anyway, we left to go on our vacation, and I had been raised in Southern California. So as we were driving up through Illinois and Indiana, my eyes were like this, because I had not seen farms quite like that before. And, I just had not, I had never been really in the Midwest except for St. Louis. And so anyway, we got to my husband's cousin's home and had dinner, and we're just really enjoying a time talking about getting together for a family reunion that we were going to have that weekend. And we ended up getting in the car with my husband's aunt, and she was driving us to her house. So it was my husband's aunt and my mother-in-law and my husband and my son and I. And we were driving to her home. She was driving the car. She was driving to her house. She'd gone from her daughter's house to her house, I don't know how many hundreds of times. And yet on the way there, we made a stop at a stop sign, and there was a gentleman who ran the stop sign just as we started going and hit us broadside. He was going, I think they estimated about 60 miles an hour. And my husband was killed instantly. My husband's aunt was killed instantly. And our 2-year-old was in the back seat between us, and he suffered really severe head injuries. And then I had my belt on. We all had our belts on and stuff, but I was actually thrown out of the car and landed in the middle of one of those fields that earlier in the day I thought were really cool. And when you land in the middle of one, it's not so cool then. And yet from the very earliest time right after that, I knew that something really, really serious had happened. I was in and out of shock at that time. And yet, by the time I got to the emergency room, there were really 2 things that I could remember. One was my parents' phone number in California. And the other one was that verse in Lamentations. And so I just kept telling the nurses and the doctors that were taking care of me in the emergency room. They airlifted Johnny. Initially, they took him to the same ER that they took me to, and then airlifted him to Children's. So I was very alert. I knew what was going on, but the thing I kept telling them was that verse in Lamentations. And so, just for me in my life, when I hear about faith and people ask about salvation and people question whether or not God is real, it's something that I take so seriously, because for me personally, I remember saying to Mark just a couple of weeks before our accident that if anything happened to Johnny, just put me in a straitjacket and put me in the head injury room that was all padded at the hospital, because there's no way that I could survive something like that. And to know that that's really, all I really wanted to be was a wife and a mom, and my nursing was fine on the side, but yet God met me. And I think even in the shock of my body coming in and out of shock, the trauma of the injuries that I sustained, God was right there with me. And, I think God does allow us. People would say to me, are you mad at God for causing your accident or whatever? And I really don't look at it that way. I feel like we live in a sinful world and people sin and there's consequences to that. Could God have prevented it? Yeah, he could have, but that's not what he chose. He allowed it to happen. And yet he remained faithful to me during that time and in the almost 30 years since then. So, when we think about prayer, when we think about, just our relationship with God and interacting with him, sometimes things happen that really, really stink. And yet God does remain faithful. We were talking a little bit about the series that we're doing at Main Street, going through Exodus. And one of the things that we were talking about is that, here God told Moses to go to Pharaoh and tell him to let the people go. And this is what we're planning. There's the dogs. But, that he told Pharaoh, hey, God said, let my people go. And what ended up happening was Pharaoh got harder on them. And Pharaoh, instead of demanding they make so many bricks, demanded they make more bricks and not give them the straw. And how Moses cried out to God, and he's like, wait, God, where are you? And I could just really relate to that, I think, in my life, because I think there's times where we feel like we're doing the right thing, we're doing what God tells us to do, and then things get kind of crazy, or it doesn't happen the way that we expect it to. And yet his faithfulness remains. He is consistent, and he is real, and he's a very active part of our life. And he comes to us. He brings his compassion, his mercy. And anyway, that's been my story, I think, for the last 30 years in a way that I could have never anticipated, early on in my Christian life.
Yeah. Mary, thank you so much. Let me ask you a question or two related to that. First of all, could you remind us Lamentations 3:31 and 32?
Mm-hmm.
Just give us that verse again.
Mm-hmm. It says, though God causes grief, he will bring compassion. So great is his unfailing love. And then earlier in the chapter is Lamentations 3:21 and 22, which talks about God's mercies and his kindness are new every morning. Great is his faithfulness. So it's kind of become my favorite chapter in scripture. And we're really fortunate that at Main Street, that's kind of our closing prayer every Sunday, is to sing "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases." And, when Johnny was little, our son, I used to rock him and sing to him, "Great is thy faithfulness." That was kind of my song that I sang to him. And then as I've gotten remarried and we've adopted our daughter, Grace, from China, that's really been my theme. I think through my older children that my husband had when we got married, and just with Grace, is that God is faithful. And even when those things happen, or we think we're going one direction, he goes, "Nope, we're going this other direction," or he allows grief to happen in our lives, that he is constant and consistent and faithful.
Yeah, beautiful. That is really an encouragement to us when we're in the middle of asking God and we're feeling like things aren't changing. If I can take you back almost 30 years now to when you were in the hospital and
Mm-hmm.
little Johnny had been airlifted to a different hospital, you couldn't be with him because you were dealing with your own injuries.
Yeah.
And surely you were calling out to God with all your heart that he would recover and that he would be okay. And then you got the news that he did not survive.
Mm-hmm.
And how did God's faithfulness that you're talking about sustain you there? How do you even pray in a time like that?
I think it was interesting because I could remember my parents' phone number. They called my parents pretty quickly, and so my parents, were in California. They found out about the accident within like an hour of it happening. And I remember my mom saying at first they knew Johnny had been injured, but they were like, "Well, Mark's with him. Of course Mark's with him." They knew I was injured, and as time went on, she said we started picking up on the fact that Mark wasn't with him. And when you think back just to a couple of weeks prior to that, I mean, I just had remembered thinking if anything happened to him, I just don't know what I would do. And yet I will tell you that even during that time, I did not freak out. Um, God's peace was there. It isn't that I didn't cry. It isn't that I wasn't feeling the immense pain, not only physically, but certainly emotionally. But God was present. And I never remember really thinking, honestly, that Johnny was going to survive. I kind of just remember thinking very early on, I knew Mark was gone already. And I just was like, my mom said to me, she goes, when you would say, "Mom, Johnny's really bad," and pray for him. But she said, "You almost said, I know he's not going to make it." And, that's a tough thing as a mom. I think when you think about life and you think about some of the heartaches and some of the, heartaches and pains that you go through and the losses that you go through, certainly the loss of a child is one. And, over the years, God has never left me, even during those Mother's Days that came up frequently for many, many years after that. It isn't that I didn't feel that pain, because I definitely felt that pain and heartache. But I also know that as you cry out to God, he brings mercy and he brings compassion. And I always tell Nick Hahn, Doug Hahn's son, that Nick was a real blessing to me in those early Mother's Days, because we'd be at church and they would give out carnations to all the moms. And here would Nick come as a teenager walking up the aisle and make sure that he gave one to me. And so it's those ways that God reminds you, I haven't forgotten you, and I am going to be faithful, and it will be different than you could ever imagine or think. And I'm also looking forward to seeing him again someday, as probably a 6'3" guy, not a 3-foot-year-old, 2-year-old. So.
Yeah. Mary, thank you for that. I think it's easy for us to live in the fear of not knowing how could we handle it if the worst were to happen and we were to lose someone or something super precious to us. We just can't see how would we do that. And your encouragement that God was there is really such a precious thing that we need. Thank you for that. Is there anything else you'd want to just share with Mercy Hill or leave as a final encouragement?
No, I think what you just said about God is there. And I remember, when I read that devotion by Johnny, just her talking about she couldn't move her physical body, right? She couldn't lift her hands up. She couldn't get on her knees. It was an attitude of the heart just to turn her face to the Lord and how God meets us. And it's supernatural. We don't understand it. It doesn't make sense. And that's how you know your faith is more than a religion, that it is about a relationship. And, it doesn't mean we're not going to have heartache. And it doesn't mean that I don't fear losing people close to me now. I mean, you don't want to walk through those times, but at the same time, I know that God will be faithful no matter what comes down my path. And that has certainly been the case.
Amen. Mary, thank you again. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you sharing with us today.
You are very welcome. You are really welcome. I hope we can get up for a visit sometime soon.
That would be great. Thanks.
Take care.